everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Artificial Intelligence series, part of the Digital Transformation Lab out of Cork University Business School, which is part of University College Cork. We're absolutely delighted to have Alan W. Brown. I don't know how important the W is, Alan, but we'll just make it official. So I know we've been tracking Alan for a while. We've been following his material for a while, not just in the AI space, but also in the digital space. And also, I know we probably share a background, Alan, going back into the software, into the agile space as well. So we're absolutely delighted to have Alan with us. And Alan, maybe I'll ask you to say a few words about yourself rather than me trying to introduce who you are. And then we'll hand over to Tony maybe to fire a first question at you.
Thanks, Poddy, and thanks, Tony. Yeah, I've got quite a long background, particularly in software development and delivery. That's sort of my thing. And after I did a PhD in computer science up in University of Newcastle in the UK, I taught for a little while, for a couple of years at the University of York. And after 3 or 4 years of that, I thought, you know what, I need to get out and start to practice this. I got, the theory's fine, doing the odd program for experimentation's great. But like many of your audience, I'm sure, you want to get out there and you want to see what it's like in the real world. So I headed off to the US. And I went to a place called the Software Engineering Institute over at in Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And we were working with large-scale defense systems, primarily. It's a federally funded center. So working on large software systems, FAA, air traffic control systems, military systems, and a lot of sort of what you might call high-integrity software systems. And I learned a lot working on large-scale projects about not just the software side, but the processes, the practices, the organizational issues, the challenges you face when you try and bring large-scale systems into production. So that became much more my interest, less the software and the details of the technology, and much more how do we get software-based systems in place, in use, and changing the way people work and operate. So you want the outcome from those systems, often in very complex circumstances. And that got me moving on a journey where I spent about 20 years in the US. I worked at Texas Instruments. I worked at some large-scale software systems. And then we, like you did at that time, you went and did a startup in Silicon Valley. And we did a startup that grew from 2 people to a couple of hundred people. It was doing software development and delivery products and tools. And we eventually sold that business for most of $500 million to a company called Rational Software Corporation. Year and a half later, that sold to IBM. So I ended up back in a large-scale change management kind of role with large organizations. And I worked for IBM for a while in the US and in Europe. I spent 5 years in Spain with IBM, and then came across to the UK. And I started trying to apply a lot of what I've been learning in those circumstances, both in a business school setting, which was an interesting challenge, which we might talk about moving from a technical role into a business role, particularly in a business school, which I think might interest both of you. And then, of course, I work with a lot of organizations, including government organizations, large corporations inside the UK and elsewhere.
Excellent. Well, Alan, I have read the book. It is a great read. And what I really love about it is that you anchor it in digital transformation, because that conversation is getting lost at the moment. But what was the genesis behind the book? What got you to write it?
Yeah, I think you mentioned that I've been writing things. And like many people, the COVID experience was a shock for many people in many ways. We can talk about it technically and we can talk about it organizationally, but also personally for many people, it was a bit of a shock. And one of the things, I didn't go out and buy a puppy or whatever. I decided what I was going to do was try to capture what I was learning and what I was doing and what I was feeling about the work, about the things I was learning about. And I set myself a target, which was to write 1,000 words every week and to publish it about what I saw going on, what I was reading, the conversations I was having. And I began to build over. Now it's 3 years. I've been publishing every week and publishing them online that you guys have been reading and others have been reading. And over that time, my understanding and experiences and my interactions with people have grown and deepened and matured. And I wanted to try to capture some of that and said, here's my journey. Here's what I've been learning. Here's the questions I've been asking. Here's how I'm going about framing those questions. And here's what I think I still don't understand. And I wanted to put that together because when I tried to explain that with people, they resonated with that kind of way of thinking. There's various ways we could do it. I debated whether a book was even relevant in this kind of age, but I think it's a good way of consolidating a lot of ideas, putting them into something which is perhaps a little bit more archival or a place that you can dip in, and then to start to use that for other things. And the book was the result of that.
Interesting, because I did see a headline there the other day, and it was, AI is going to be the cause of even more digital transformation failures. So, when you wrote the book, I mean, you clearly had a lens of digital transformation. Maybe elaborate a little bit about that.
Yeah, but both in the work I was doing, so I'm now working part-time in the university and part-time going out working with companies and advising and supporting. So I've got this combination of two hats, and both in the research work and in the work in practice, what we were beginning to see was let me call it a sort of digital transformation fatigue. People starting to say, oh, not that again. Haven't we done this digital stuff for the last 20 years? What's new? What's different? Isn't it, just more of the same? And whether, the last few years it was blockchain, the years before that it was about cloud, the years before that it was, and here's another one. And you get this kind of interesting dynamic going on about how do these technologies influence what we do? How do we look at their introduction? How do we go from the excitement and, the hype at the beginning through to the, what does Gartner call it? The trough of disillusionment, and then back through to the reality of its delivery. We're going through some similar circumstances with all of these technologies. So I was quite interested in that journey, but then also asking the question, so what's different now? What is there that's new and different and interesting about this AI phase that we're going through? And I was trying to compare and contrast that, I think, Tony, more than anything else. And when I'm working with organizations, a lot of the issues and the questions and the comments that I get, particularly from more senior leaders in the organization, are not about the technology per se. They're about technology impact, technology robustness, strategy, how it influences and changes their culture, the way they work, their leadership models. And I was trying to get a more holistic view of that, because I think that's what most organizations are looking for, is they're trying to find the ways of balancing how these different influences affect the whole of their organization. So for me, thinking about that, particularly in what I call large established organizations, LEOs, which could be a government agency, a third sector organization, or a commercial organization, because they're large, they've got scale issues. Because they're established, they've got legacy issues. Because they're complex organizations, they've got political issues and cultural issues. And once you tie those together, you've got a really interesting, I don't know, potpourri of challenges there.
And I know something that you focus on quite early in the book, but I've also seen it. And by the way, those posts you write weekly or whenever are fantastic. And I think they're called the Digital Economy Dispatches, Alan. So well worth anyone that's looking for a nice background to your work to have a look at that, as well as, of course, buying the book. But this idea, you pitch it out quite early, and I think it's quite powerful, this idea of a revolution, that there's a revolution happening. What I was interested in is, when do you feel it started? And is it AI is accelerating it, or is AI causing it, or what difference is AI making to it, Alan?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Paddy. I think I think the best way for me to think about this is to give you a little illustration, if that's okay. So partly I use the idea of revolution to be provocative, to get people to say, well, what do you mean? Isn't it just an evolution of things? So let me give you an illustration. So I've got, in front of me a glass of water, and I could take, anything around me. And the way we've started to think about this is any analog device, in this case a glass, can be wrapped in a digital wrapper in today's environment. And what do I mean by that? So obviously I could put a little bit of technology in the base of this glass. And of course, this little bit of technology now is miniaturized and, super powerful, and the power consumption is getting reduced. There's all of the technical things we could talk about. And it transmits data by Bluetooth to my phone, from my phone to the cloud. So that's a kind of context in which almost anything can be wrapped now. whether it's you know, the keyboard in front of me, whether it's the pen I'm holding, whether it's the glass, whether it's my body wrapped in a digital wrapper through one of these kind of devices. So I can wrap anything. Why is that interesting? So what? Well, I can do interesting things with this. I can now send a stream of data telling you where this thing is, GPS. I can tell you about the weight of this thing so I know how much liquid's in it. I can tell you something about the temperature of it. I can tell you something about the constituency of it. Is it water? Is it gin? It's water, by the way. You know, what is it? I can tell you something about its freshness. I can tell you something about maybe who's drinking it and how often, its movement, you know, from accelerometers and other things. So now I can start to do something very interesting. This is where I think is the revolution. I stop thinking about this as a glass, and I start thinking about this as a data delivery device. And what I start to learn is about the context in which this is used. Where, how often, what's put in it, how it moves around the building, who drinks from it. Does Alan drink more in certain situations than others, more in the morning, more in the evening? He drinks hot drinks at night. When the temperature's warm outside, he drinks cold drinks. He drinks them all at once. And I can start to connect that to things like if I'm wearing a Fitbit or something, which tells me about blood sugar levels, heartbeat, I can say, when his heart rate's up, does he drink more? In fact, when his heart rate's up, shall I tell him to drink more? Does it affect him? Does it affect his stress? Is it a stress reliever? What effect is it having on Alan? When and how? So immediately, without thinking too hard about it, I'm now thinking about this about, well, where's the outcome and the value that this delivers? What's the behavioral impact it has? How would I use this in different circumstances? Could I convince Alan to drink more, to be healthier, to drink more water? Can I sell him more drinks? Can I sell him more vessels to put drinks in? And I start to move to a different way of thinking. And the classic way, from a marketing and from a business school point of view, the classic way we thought about value distribution, value approaches was typically based around things like value in exchange. I sell you the glass, I get your money, you get the glass. I'm incented to sell you as many glasses as I can and drive down the price of production and delivery of these glasses. You're trying to negotiate a lower price for these things. What we've moved to is value in use. I don't sell you the glass. I may give you the glass. I may rent you the glass. But what I want to know is how you use it. And I get reward from you finding value in the use of the glass. For drinking, for rehydration, for putting flowers in, for whatever you're using the glass for. I want to understand that so I can start to drive new ways of thinking about business, like usage-based pricing, like utility-based pricing, like scarcity-based pricing. You know, I can start to drive a whole new set of business models. Why? Because I can get constant stream of data. Where are you? How are you using? How often? When? Who are you with? How did it affect you? That, to me, is revolutionary. That's a completely different way of rethinking what's going on in our world. And that affects so many things of what we're doing. And we could look at many dimensions there. One obvious dimension is, if I'm incented to sell you as many glasses, I don't care if you throw them in the tip, if you never use them, if you've got 50 unused glasses in your cupboard. If I'm incented in usage, I only get paid if you use it. I don't produce them if they're not usable. I don't want them low utility in the cupboard. I want them highly utilized. I want to be able to understand the life cycle of this, maybe because I want to offer repair. I want to recycle it. I want to reuse. I want multiple people using the same artifacts. That's a completely revolutionary way of thinking about things like sustainability. You know, and of course, that's part of what we see in the marketplace, right? So I'm going to argue this simple idea of massive compute power, miniaturization of technology, driving data delivery and data quality, running algorithms on this so we can understand it. That's what I mean by AI and the AI revolution. And that's changed everything about what we do, how we think about the world, how we offer products, how we look at ourselves, how we service them, what value means. That's a revolution. That's, I think, really interesting.
But Alan, in the book, though, you do highlight this, that, yeah, it's great if you have people who get that, but actually in most organizations, most don't get it. And the risk that organizations run is they have a small group of people who really get it, and then they become isolated and detached because the rest of the organization rejects them. So let's say, right, what you're talking about is absolutely brilliant, but how do we get an organization to think like that?
Yeah, well, to some extent, going back to Pardy's innovation interests, let's go back to Clay Christensen and the innovator's dilemma, perhaps the most famous theory in innovation over the last 50 years. And the innovator's dilemma was says a couple of both profound and very simple things. If you keep so here's my characterization. You might have a better one, Pardy, about what Clay Christensen said. If you keep doing the things that made you successful, they'll eventually kill you. That's what he said. And from a technological point of view, we get trapped into saying, I know a way of selling you glasses or whatever it is I'm doing, using technology in a certain way. And it drives you to a set of behaviors about how you see the world, what you optimize, and you're forcing yourself into sort of incremental improvements. We can talk about S-curves, we can talk about all sorts of things, but incremental improvements. And if I'm dominating a market and I've been working in this market for a long time, everything is pushing me to saying, add a little bit more, make it a bit cheaper, drive it into a new market. Think about how you could miniaturize that. Could you extend its lifetime? You're pushing innovation towards incremental improvements. What happens is somebody comes along and says, I don't see it that way. I see a different way of solving this problem. I see a different set of concerns. I see a different solution set that we could apply here. I see a different value proposition. And they come in and they blow away a marketplace. And you end up with these two aspects. This can happen inside an organization. And we see it often where, the old stories we all tell in business schools about what happened to Kodak. It wasn't they didn't understand about digital cameras and digital film. It was somebody comes along and says, hey, boss, I got this great idea. It's this digital camera. You don't need film. And Kodak says, we make money out of film. That's where our revenue and our profits come from. We sell film. What are you talking about? You don't need film. Go away. And this was in the same organization. And eventually somebody comes along that doesn't have that legacy and kind of set of constraints. And they say, you know what, I got this completely different way of working, and they blow it apart. And we see that in organizations all the time. We see this struggle, this tension between driving something new, which may have deep effects on your current way of working, thinking, market, organization. And those that say, no, that's what I do. I get my sales guy gets the quota for the year, gets what's in the price book, gets the territory and says, leave me alone. I'm just going to sell my stuff. Don't bother me. I know I'm going to make my bonus this year. So you've got these tensions always in an organization. And that's what I think that dynamic is interesting to me. That's really what's at play in all of these organizations right now.
And I'm always intrigued, and this idea that, with these paradigm shifts, that very often we see the new paradigm through the lens of the previous paradigm. So for example, the early cars looked like something like a carriage that you'd
they were called horseless carriages. That's
exactly,
what they were called.
And I'm intrigued. Even if you look at, let's say, the start of the internet age, we thought that selling would be brochure-led, and all sorts. And no one really foresaw at the time what Larry Page, Sergey Brin were going to do, maybe around search and the business models that it opened up, And I'm wondering, like, is the real revolution going to be that revolution in thinking that we just haven't quite? We don't even see it yet. We can't sort of comprehend it yet. But it's going to really change everything, And sometimes I'm wondering, what is that going to look like? What is that going to feel like?
I think that's a great question. And going back to the horseless carriages kind of stuff, and of course, remember we still typically measure cars in horsepower, which is quite funny, really. What woke me up in the internet era, and I don't know what woke you up, but there was a thing called the Clue Train Manifesto. I don't know if you remember that, which was something that came out that I read. Sometimes you read something and you go, whoa, hold on a minute, what the heck is this? And I read the Clue Train Manifesto, and it starts off with people of Earth, which kind of was quite funny, and it has a series of thoughts. And the first thought is, markets are conversations. And the internet is about creating a new kind of conversation. That's what it's for. And I thought, I've never heard that before. And it's never been said in that way before. What the heck does that mean? And that got me thinking about, what is the internet? What's it for? It's not, pushing out publicity on a web page from a company saying, come buy our products, and it's the new digital front door to their store. It's different. It's completely changing, as we might say in business schools, agency, how interaction, who's in charge of what, the power dynamic. It starts to reshape how we look at markets. Now that to me was a revolutionary thought, particularly coming as a tech guy. And I started to say, what does that mean? And I think we're starting to see a couple of those things happen with AI right now. Rather than simply say, this compute power and deep neural nets means we can, the difference between chess and Go with the use of AI. If you haven't seen recently the movie AlphaGo, it came out a few years ago. I watched it again recently and was quite stunned by it, because it tells you a lot of these stories, or maybe it's just reflecting back on my own experience. It tells you some of these stories. The chess story was, we can run compute power and fancy algorithms to be able to look at all the possible patterns of use, different ways of playing, looking at all the grandmasters of what they did. And then we could quickly look through all of those and pick one that's the right one to do. What happened with AlphaGo and of course AlphaGo Zero is it said, no, we don't do that. We learn in a different way. And we do self-supervised reinforcement learning, whatever the fancy stuff you might want to call around it. Let's for now just say, I learn on my own. And I come up with completely new ways of thinking, some of which, of course, matches what we've been doing in terms of Go for 1,000 years, some of which we've never even thought about. We've never considered, do this next, or this is an appropriate move, because we've been trapped into 1,000 years of working and thinking in one way. It completely revolutionizes that. And in the movie, you see that. You see this the shift from, we now think about this technology in a different way, working and operating and changing our perception of things like, in this case, it was something simple like the game of Go. But if you apply that to medicine, to policymaking, to legal constructs, to the way in which we consider how we build large skyscrapers, we may come up with completely different ways of thinking. Not just, we made that a little bit better. We now have ways of working quickly around many options and looking at patterns of what's been happening in the past. No, now we're moving into a different world. We might call that creativity. You might argue that isn't creativity, but I think we're moving into that different set of thinking and working and looking at what AI is.
Yeah, and I think it's a great example. And I know, I suppose what was shocked a lot of people was, Lee Sedol afterwards sort of saying that it changed his view of himself and his view of humanity and what it meant to be humans. And I think we're on that cusp, it will change the way we view ourselves, humanity, our position in the world. And I think at the moment, a lot of folks in AI is on automation. And I think, to me, that's missing some of the point, missing some of the revolutionary element of AI, where it's going to change everything. Like that move 37, I think it's referred to in one of those games, when Lee Sedol played Alpha Go, was a move that the experts thought was a real mistake by AI, but actually turned out to be a game changer. It was a move that a human could not really comprehend, and yet was revolutionary, and yeah. I'm intrigued by that element of the revolutionary element of AI.
If you haven't watched it lately, and I hadn't for a couple of years, it really woke me up to a few things. Move 37 is that sort of the move that the computer made that Lee Sedol couldn't understand. He got up and walked away, didn't he? Because he couldn't work. He couldn't. What is? I don't know what this is. But you remember, so that was interesting. But you remember what happened in I think it was a game or two later, which they started to call the God move, where he actually did win one of the games of the 5, and he played a move the computer couldn't understand, and that was interesting. How the human played a move the computer couldn't understand, and essentially the computer then sort of just went off track and started playing ridiculous moves, and Lee Sedol easily won then. And it was one of those things, and they said, where did that move come from? And he said, I didn't see any other move. It was just the move. And they all said, no, that was genius. And there's this thing between human computer. It sort of lays that out. And when Lee Sedol lost the first game, he apologized to the human race for his failings in a deeply, kind of sad way. It was very, very interesting. That whole movie tells you a lot about that relationship between technology and humanity, which I found fascinating. That sounds like you did too.
So Alan, is one of the challenges here, and you call it out in the book, is, well, actually, what do we mean by AI? Right? So, I mean, every boardroom in the world is saying to the executive, what are we doing about AI? But actually, do they even know what they're asking? And do the executive even know what they're being asked? So how do we get over this problem that everything is called AI?
Yeah, it's a strong point, and I'm going to sort of defend it by not defining AI and trying to get away with it. Let's see if I can. I think we saw that with digital transformation. So what is or isn't a digital transformation now? I upgrade my back office system, to a new version. Is that a digital transformation? I move from paper to digital, and use PDF instead of having to sign something by hand. Is that digital? I think about a new way of doing a process that says, instead of having to do something in a certain way, perhaps the way I apply for a driving license or something, that it can automatically detect when I'm on the road, so it can automatically see if I'm entitled to be on the road. You start to go through and you say, I'm not quite sure what digital and digital transformation means. I think we're in the same thing with AI. I think we started off with quite tight definitions, and you could give several of them. Advanced compute power with deep neural nets is essentially what the AlphaGo kind of precedent was. The way it was used in some of those areas was a very tight view of what AI means. I think people are now starting for it to mean more sophisticated digital technologies with high-powered computing, so that I can start to do more with the digital technologies that are around, with some improvements in the UI, with some understanding of the use cases or the usage models where I'm going to apply it. They've used it in a much broader sense, and I think some people find it useful to have that broader view. AI is about adding more intelligence to the digital technologies that are already available. A lot of that is simple pattern matching. A lot of that is being able to harvest data we've had around for a long time and haven't been able to access. A lot of that is adding a faster bandwidth communication between siloed sites. Is it AI? It's not in the sense of artificial human intelligence, but it is in the sense of artificial process intelligence, or some other word in the middle. So I think we've got variations there. And I think a lot of what we see in organizations now is we're starting to make a lot of investment. Where's the ROI? Where's the money? Show me the return. Which is why we've gone back to saying, well, where will we see that? Customer service, summarizing complex documents, allowing people to do more content delivery, whether it's marketing or anything else. It's in those sorts of what I will call relatively mundane areas, but we can see a return very quickly because they're very close to the bottom line. We need 20 of these. It takes us an hour. Now it takes us 5 minutes. We can easily monetize things like that. And I think that's what we're seeing. And so, for example, in the UK government, sort of pre-election, was talking a lot about AI is going to revolutionize the civil service. How? We'll be able to cut jobs, back office jobs, customer service, remove appointments so that people can self-service online. It was a very restricted view of what that intelligence could do, but easily monetizable in the current sort of economic measurement climate that we're in.
Yeah, and I know Tony Blair as well is sort of really advocating sort of the role of AI within the sort of UK public sector. And there's something I'm intrigued, and I think it ties in with it. And I know you make a very important or put a very important focus on sort of AI at scale. But at the same time, you're also maybe pointing out some of the issues with AI at the moment, though. Large AI projects are failing. There's concerns around maybe, AI safety. There's tying in with the ethics side. Are we really ready to scale, though? Whether it's in the public sector in the UK or anywhere, are we really ready to scale? Is it the wrong advice to be giving?
That's a good question. What I did between the middle of last year and the middle of this year, one of the projects I was lucky to work on was with the National Audit Office in the UK. And of course, they look at large government programs and try to look at things like value for money for public spend. And one of the investigations I was asked to work on was to do with the use of AI in government. How is AI deploying, how is government deploying AI, and what kind of value are we getting from it? Are they understanding the implications? And that allowed me to look at some uses of AI at scale, large government departments. And if I can say so, there are sort of three usage models for AI, where we can talk about scale and we can talk about value delivery. The first is what I'll call large AI projects. So in the government case, it might be facial recognition at the border. It might be fraud detection in revenue collection. It might be something to do with social services and being able to understand who requires social services in what demographic. Large programs that are defined, as we've always defined large digital programs, requirements definition, setting out a tender, getting responses, all of that. There's a lot of controls around those. We've struggled for many reasons with these large complex programs, but it's often to do with scale in the sense of it's got to be delivered across a large set of organizations. We're going to have millions of people hitting this service. The service has got to cover a wide plethora of people and circumstances. We've got existing systems and processes in place, and we've got to somehow, cut over from the old to the new. All of the things that large projects have, AI projects have to deal with. Plus, they've got perhaps some new technologies in there and some new issues because of the way they use data and some other issues piled on top. So we've got to deal with them in the context of those large, complex program changes that occur. And some cases they're doing that well. Some cases they're struggling with the same issues they've struggled with before. And you can read in the newspapers and online about large government programs and the challenges they've had as they've moved forward. I won't even dare to mention the Post Office Horizon scandal. So we know we've got examples of AI in that, and a lot of what we're going to do is follow traditional approaches, and there's a governance mechanism around it and a set of challenges we know we have to face. But there's two other usage models, I think, for AI. The second one is that as we use technologies, like we're using a technology now for collaboration and recording this podcast, or we're using Outlook for sending emails or writing articles. Tools like that are getting more AI embedded within them. So the next time we use Zoom, it might have a new AI feature that automatically detects my face, has something around sentiment analysis that says Alan's happy or Tony's bored or time to move on. We could add a bunch of AI-based capabilities to the tool. Now, whether I like it or not, as soon as I upgrade, I get those. I don't know where they come from, don't know how they were written, don't know how they were trained, don't know if they're biased against certain faces with certain genders or hairstyles or eye color. I don't know. And I have no control over that. Yet, that's now in the middle of us recording this. It might filter things. It might change how we talk about things. It might stop people of different backgrounds being able to contribute, or how it might prioritize whose questions comes first. I don't know how these systems work, and I don't know the impact that will have on us. Yet we're now using them. We're not really understanding that very much, and we're not putting a lot of controls around that. And that is a little bit scary in some certain circumstances where the impact of that might be quite severe, particularly in government services, but also in commercial services and elsewhere. And then just to finish off, there's a third one, which is to do with, let's take a hypothetical example. Somebody in a social services situation or in a job center or in some other situation in government has a whole bunch of electronic case notes about somebody who's going to talk to them in the next few minutes. They haven't had time to read those case notes. They're complex. They've been developed over several years. They come from different places. They're in different files. I could just throw them through a Gen AI LLM-based system and say, give me the 3 questions I should ask this person coming to see me. Should they do that? Is that appropriate? How does that work? Who's guardrailing that? Are we making sure that they're asking the appropriate questions? Who trained that? What happens when the responses aren't what we expected? Is that a good thing? By the way, the alternative is this person who hasn't read the case notes is going to ask them questions with no information and no guidance. Is that worse?
Yeah.
We're in those situations right now, and we could name a dozen situations like that where we'll call it sort of the gray area of people are saying, that tool's really easy online. I could just push it through that tool, and out would come the response to an email that I've been struggling with, or a document that I've got to get done by 9 o'clock and it's 8:45, or I've got somebody seeing me in 10 minutes and I need a summary.
Yeah, we've been having this discussion for the last number of months, and the reality is, all this technology is on every smartphone in the world now, right? And I think there was a report there that said that generative AI tools, ChatGPT is probably the #1 unofficial app used by employees all over the world, regardless of whether their employers know it or not.
Yeah.
But in the book you mentioned, I was laughing when I read it. Paul Kedrowski, is that how you pronounce it? He said ChatGPT is a virus and we're unprepared for the impact of this virus. Now, what is interesting, when we talk to companies and we say, well, what policies have you in place for the use of generative AI? There's a lot of silence.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, we know it's there. We know everyone has it on their phone, but actually we haven't any basic policies in place, never mind sophisticated policies in place. Isn't that a real problem?
I think some, to be slightly flip about it, I think some organizations have some policies, which is don't ask, don't tell, or catch me if you can, which isn't really a great policy. There is some of that going on right now. I think the policy issue is a really tricky one. An example, we've probably all got our examples. I was on a conference call the other day with some government people, and there were 50 or 60 people, and it was Zoom or Teams or something, and up popped this little message that said, this meeting is now being recorded, and an AI-based transcript and summary is being created. And somebody said, hold on a minute, I didn't agree to that. What's it summarizing? How's it summarizing what I'm saying? How's it picking out the key points? Who's it prioritizing? Well, I don't think we're allowed to use that. And somebody said, oh, there's a policy that says we can't do that. And somebody says, no, that policy has been superseded now. That's overtaken by the broader government one that says we can do this. Oh, well, this isn't really in that because this is offline. This isn't a really, and honestly, the first 10 minutes was this chaos. Is this thing allowed to record what we're saying and create a summary? And it was sort of, this illustrates the problem. We're not sure anymore the circumstances in which these technologies are being used, how they're being used, why they're being used, who's got their access to it. And it's the usual thing, authority and responsibility. I don't understand that anymore in some of these. And I think this is another reason why I think we call it a revolution party, is because we're in a circumstance right now where we're not quite sure how this works, who's in charge, whether the principles that we had previously apply now or don't. And it's confusing. And I think we're going to see that for some time. And for many of us, that's an area rich for research, of course. And also for those who are consultants and advisors, it's a massive area where organizations are looking for help.
And I think it is very interesting, and there's this idea of the shadow IT, or and like if we've learned anything from these technologies, very often what drives that shadow isn't necessarily people at the bottom level. Very often it's leaders starting to do stuff, and cut corners, etc. And I know for a fact, some of the stuff, and I won't name any organizations either, that I know when I'm going in talking about some of this stuff, that actually if people, I suppose, open up, they start talking about the stuff they're doing as leaders with generative AI, trialing it out, and in some cases not really being aware of some of the potential repercussions. And that brings me to a point, because I think I found it really, really interesting, and it's something that also has been very important, or a discussion very important within the sort of software side, is this idea that it's now been led by the business, that AI, the move maybe towards generative AI is being led by the business. And maybe the sense of maybe that lack of control that might bring, or the lack of a discipline you know, around when we should use and when we shouldn't use technology. Have we tested those technologies? Have we validated them? Any comments about that? Because I think it is a really important thing. I think it's a discussion also that's been happening with no code and low code. Alan, where are we going with this?
Well, there's a couple of big ideas there, I think you brought out that I've tried to address a little bit in the book, but of course it's just early comments that I think all of us should be thinking about and writing about and talking about. And one of them is, particularly as we get to more senior leaders and decision makers, there's an interesting question we've always had, which is, what do they need to know about these technologies to make better decisions at their level? We've had that issue for a while. You know, what should they know about all of the digital technologies? I think it's particularly true with AI. What do they need to know to make better decisions? Obviously, they can't be technological experts because they've got other things they have to focus on and deal with. But it's the way I look at it, you know, maybe you also teach on an MBA. You know, I teach on MBAs and things like that. And you can't imagine somebody leaving a business school in a good business school with a good MBA, leaving that and saying, you know, I don't know how profit and loss works. I don't know how balance sheet works. You'd say it's not a real business school. But we have people leaving with MBAs that don't understand digital technologies in any form, what AI does to decision making, where AI fits in the big decisions that are being made through algorithms and through the use of this compute technology. We have people leaving without that knowledge and that understanding. And we've got to put that back in to the teaching, but also into helping people who are in place and making these decisions to say, these technologies have impact. And what I've been trying to say in the book and elsewhere is we've got to educate, particularly decision making and leaders and managers, about why these technologies matter. You know, this idea of why do I care about AI is not just about, well, it's a faster way of doing stuff, isn't it? And it'll make you more efficient. It's going to revolutionize how we think about risk, trust, and value. And if you're a decision maker, if you're a leader, if you're somebody driving change, risk, trust, and value are right at the heart of everything you do, whether you're in the public sector, the private sector, third sector. These are the core elements of your life. They are going to change as a result of what's happening today. You need to start to think about big ideas like risk, trust, and value through a different set of lenses, because we're now able to deliver in a different way, be able to collaborate in new ways, think about the world in new ways. And those big ideas are going to be sufficiently different to the way they were 20 years ago, that your job, your role, your effectiveness, your success will not be able to be the same as it was in pre-AI times. And if you don't see that, you're going to really struggle.
So, Alan, one of the things you talk about in the book is this new social collaboration between humans and technology. And I think McKinsey's had a report out recently that said, actually, you're in an organization, something like 9% of your people are typically IT people. But actually, in this new world, everyone can be in IT. So one of the things you talk about is, and I found it fascinating, you talk about, you know, in the traditional role you set out you write your programs, all that sort of stuff. But I think you used the declarative was the way you described it. You now describe what you want, right? And the technology goes and does it, and it gets it right or it gets it wrong, but it learns and it does it better the next time. That surely has massive potential for every organization in the world.
It does, and for those of us who've been around the block a few times, we've been around this a few times with whether we call it fourth generation languages or case tools, or now we've got low code, no code kind of environments, and we've now got more kind of AI based data driven systems. A lot of the push in computing really has been that move from having to describe the system in detail and its architecture to describing the problem in some detail and allowing the technology to solve that problem. And we've always had that challenge. And a lot of the difficulties, I would argue, as to why software systems fail is because we've got these two worldviews, the technological delivery view of what this machine does and the problem view of how we understand the problem. And our job is to map the two, whether you call these, non-functional requirements and specifications, and over here you call it the system and the programs and the operational delivery. We've always got these two worlds and we're trying to tie these together. Some people have tried to bring these two together. Some people have tried to automate that link between the two. we're constantly trying to understand that. And I think with AI, we've come through a slightly different lens to solve that problem, which says, can we describe the problem we face and the rules of engagement and allow the system to decide how that might come together in the most efficient way? Where we've got very tight control over that, like game playing, like chess and Go, we can do that relatively effectively at high quality and at speed. Where it involves other things like, does somebody like this or like this, which is very difficult to do programmatically. We've got very challenging ways of looking at that. And a lot of the agile movement, for example, was a recognition of that. They were saying, you'll never get it right, so make sure you're super adaptable. If you can start to increase the through very fast adaptability, if you can start to increase the match between what you produce and what somebody wants, then you can begin to edge your way towards it. And their reasoning is an obvious one. Often you don't know what they want. And even if you know what they want now, you don't know what they're going to want tomorrow. So it's much more important to be adaptable than it is to be right. And a lot of what we've seen in these adaptive systems, whether it's AI-based systems or others, is a recognition of that and building that into the way the system works and operates and evolves. So a lot of what we see about AI does talk about evolution and adaptability of those systems. And to some extent, one of the key definitions of AI is this feedback mechanism where we learn constantly. Did this work? Whether that's adjusting weights in an LLM or having 1,000 pictures of cats, and then the next one comes along and we learn by, did we get it right or didn't we? Those sorts of things.
And like I think there is probably a frontier as well, Alan. There's some areas where you can afford to learn by adapting, but there's other areas, and I think you've probably worked in some of those critical areas. I have. I know I worked in designing software for that could end up in nuclear power plants, and you can't sort of say, well, look, we might get it wrong the first time, but the next time we'll get it right. Like, so I think there is that frontier, and I think there's also an issue where we build confidence in one area and we assume AI is going to then get it right in a different area, and that there's that transference issue, that we think because it gets it right in some of the minor stuff, it's going to get the important stuff right, which I think is maybe problematic at times. And I suppose that ties in, and I know you refer to the importance of data, and data management. For me, though, there is a difference between how we probably manage data especially prior to large language models, and now I think sometimes we can over clean data, we can over structure data, and I think that actually could be to the detriment of the value of large language models in some cases. I think our view of what data quality is may need to also change.
Yeah, in a sense, that I think the Achilles heel of all of this, everything we've said so far, I think you could say, yeah, but what about data then? And I think you can always say that with AI, because whether you call it the fuel for AI or whatever, there's certain analogies. Data is the new oil. Those analogies fall apart a bit, but the implication is we start with data. And if you say to most organizations, tell me about the state of your data and how it's managed and your understanding of its provenance and ownership of IP and the quality of that data and who's allowed to use it, and they start to go, well, it's not where we'd like it. You get these kinds of comments. And I think a lot of what we see now starts with the data infrastructure, both the data itself, data per se, where is it, what format's it in, can I access it? But more than that, the scaffolding around it, the understanding of its, whether we call it metadata or something else, the data about the data, where is it, where did it come from, who owns it, what rights do I have over it, right the way through to the data infrastructure for managing it. We've been through data lakes and data warehouses and wheelhouses and 100 other things about how we organize and structure it so that we can access it and manage it in reasonable ways. So we've got that big data issue. But I think there's an interesting difference, which I think you're sort of getting at with AI, which is the difference between being data-based, being data-driven, and being what I might call data inspired. And I think that the difference is we used to be data based, where it was very much about understanding data for archival reasons. I want to be able to look back and say, what did we sell in the last quarter? So I go back and I look at the data that's around and I produce my PowerPoint slides and whatever. I think we then moved to saying, actually, I want a dashboard. I want a sort of real time, lots of graphs and windows and block charts, so I can make decisions on this data. And now I've got a bit more real time feed. I don't have to wait 3 weeks for somebody to produce my PowerPoint pack. Now I think we're in that third phase, which is I actually want the data I need at the time I need it. And I want automation to handle a lot of it, because even when I have 23 graphs on front of me in the screen, I still don't know what I'm supposed to do. Whether that going up here and that going down there and that being the same means I should do this. Well, surely we can apply intelligence to that and be able to both reduce the stress of that data, so I don't see 23 things, I see the 3 things I need, and an interpretation of the last time we saw that 3 things happen, this is what was the issue, and this is how we needed to deal with it. And by the way, we see this thing coming up that might affect that. That becomes a much more sophisticated and different style of data use, which is neither of the first two. And I think we're beginning to see that as we've started to get a handle on our data, we're not yet in the stage where many people can use it for that third one. It's not just data that's archivally usable or visualizable in a way I can make human decisions. It's now in a state that it can be used for automated, mission-critical decision-making, often semi-autonomously, sometimes fully autonomously. That's a completely different set of criteria. And I think we see in organizations, again, going back to my what do management and leaders need to know, they need to understand some of these things. They need to understand the implications of some of that in mission-critical decision-making under uncertainty. And I don't think yet there are some people quite sophisticated who have been doing a lot of logistics and various other things. There are many organizations that haven't got anywhere close to that yet.
No, and
education is a good one, where universities are struggling like mad.
And I think educationally, I think we're a bit behind the curve on it as well, maybe, Alan, you know. And I'm reminded actually of a chief scientist that was with IBM and may have been there when you were there, though, Jeff Jonas, you know, a really interesting guy, but always said this issue that, and I'm going to paraphrase him, you know, that when we clean data, when we structure data, someone is imposing a perspective on it. So straight away, you're removing some of the richness of it. And sometimes it's as biased because of the cleaning, because of the structuring. And I think that's a big issue, that I think a lot of our data in organizations is biased because of previous structures imposed on it, you know. And I think we have to be aware of that. But also, I know we're doing stuff at the moment where we're like you're saying, you know, that we're actually involved, let's say, in discussions, particularly in design teams, where AI is monitoring those discussions in real time, trying to identify amber and red flags in terms of biases, you know, biases that are being introduced in real time into those discussions, into those decisions. Again, that's not structured data, and AI is very, very effective at working with it. You know, it doesn't need necessarily metadata. It doesn't need structured categorizations, etc. So I think all of that is really interesting. But I think for that reason, we have to maybe revisit the idea of data quality, what it is, and what high quality data is and isn't. You know.
So we could go back right to the beginning. You know, so I was very struck. I was working with the National Archive. The National Archive in the UK gathers information from court records and what goes on in Parliament and whatever, all sorts of information. It's fascinating. If ever you want to visit it, it's out in Kew, out in the west of London. It's fascinating. And when you say, how much data do you have? Their answer is 14 kilometers. What do you mean 14? You don't measure data in kilometers. And they've got shelves of stuff in the basements. You know, they've got special places where it's literally scrolls and it's bits of paper and whatever. Of course, the last 50 years, it's mostly digital data they've been gathering and stored in petabytes of data. They start with the very first question: what data should we collect? And as I understand it, they actually have room and ability to record 1% of what they're asked to save. So their first question is, which 99% of data do we not need in 20 years for the nation? How do you decide that? How do you know 20 years from now we didn't need that bit of data? Or, oh my God, why didn't we save that? That would have been really helpful to make this really important decision we're about to make about whether we have people on Mars or whatever we're going to be deciding in 20 years. Maybe not 20 years on Mars. So we've got interesting questions right from the beginning of what do we save, what do we store? And you know this, the old moniker about building models. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. A model is a decision of how you want to see something, what perspective, what characteristics, which things you want to put in focus and which things you want out of focus. Data storage is exactly the same. All data sets are wrong. Some are useful because you've made some decisions. You've decided what granularity, what quality, which attributes to store, which not to store, how to structure them. You've made those decisions.
So I want to ask you a question because I'm conscious of time. So, grand, we have the information. The real question then becomes, should we use the information? Right. So how are we going to address that in organizations and in society? So there's lots of data, and look, Web 2 is a minefield of how data has been misused, probably. But we're now moving into a world where actually the intelligence behind the data might be something we haven't seen before. How do we make the right decisions in this space?
Yeah, it's probably, as we're coming to the end, it's one of the biggest questions that we face. Again, I'll use an illustration. Working with some retail folks from some of the large supermarkets in the UK. I'm walking down the aisle of a supermarket. You're walking 10 steps behind me. As I walk down the aisle of the supermarket, the prices are all RFID tagged and displayable and changeable, and they're connected to our warehouse and our supply chain, and there's lots of AI running. It knows what I've spent in the store before. It's recognized me through facial recognition. It's connected me with my bank account, blah, 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 blah. As I walk down the aisle, the prices dynamically change because it knows what I bought last week, which brand I like, which special deal they're getting from the discounter, blah, blah, blah. So I see something and it says, this thing is, £1. You're walking 10 yards behind me and you see it says £1.20 because you're a different person in a different set of circumstances. So let's ask 3 questions. This is Poddy, this is the classic innovation. Let's ask 3 questions. Feasibility. Technically, is that possible? Well, we can talk about that. Mostly you'd say, yes, I can see how that could be done. And we can have a discussion about how you'd make that work and which data we'd store and is it on the cloud and whatever. So that's feasibility. Second one, viability. Do I make more money that way? Could I convince you, nudge you, make you spend more, increase your wallet share, all that stuff? We go through a business model or whatever, discounts. We could decide, do I make more money? That's the viability. The third one, desirability. Is that what you want? Does that make you feel like you're being discriminated against? Why am I paying more than I just saw he had £1. Now it's just gone up to 120. What is that? Is that because of who I am, what I bought, my background? Is the bias in the system? Is that allowed? Is it legal? If I work with two of my colleagues, how would that work? So you've got, classic innovation, desirability, viability, and feasibility. You have to line those things up. And I think I use that model a lot when we're going through not just can we do it, should we do it? Is that what people want? Would they pay money for it? Can I build a business model around it? Is it effective in achieving the outcome I'm trying to deliver? And I think we're in that right now with a legal framework that is arguably 10, 20 years behind, trying to understand how we put this together. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that in many different ways. What's going on in Parliament, the discussions that are going on in the boardrooms, how people are feeling. If you look at attitudes to AI surveys, and there are many of them around, you'll see people are very confused by, it's the old Zuboff stuff about surveillance economy. Am I just a product? Am I being mined for my data, strip mined for my data? There's a lot going on right now where we're in the middle of that. And I wish I had an answer for you, Tony, but I can just give you a set of observations and where we are and maybe some illustrations of how we might start to think about ways through that.
And I suppose, and I'm conscious I'll leave Tony maybe wrap it up shortly, but I suppose for the audience that's listening, Alan, you've sort of alluded to maybe things that we could, should, might do, etc. Where do you think it's actually going to go in the next, let's say, few years? You know, I know it's very hard to say where it's going to go beyond that, but where do you think this is going to go? What are the sort of things we are going to see that maybe we didn't even imagine in the next few years, or will control, will regulation become paramount, maybe?
Yeah, playing futurist is always a tricky one, and I can do, you know, the usual kinds of discussions, but let me just pick one or two things, given the time frame, that might spark a bit of a provocative thought for a few people. The first one is, if we were to start with my data belongs to me. So what you know, there's a reason why Google bought Fitbit, to get data about people's behaviors, because on your wrist, with galvanic skin response and heart rate variability, essentially you've got a stress monitor and a lie detector on your wrist 24/7. That's quite interesting information to know 24/7 how you're responding to things. What if I was to say, no, that's my data? So I think what we'll see over the next few years is a much more interesting, can data become a currency that I own, that I can take ownership of and have the usage model of? So I might decide who has my data or not. I might want some reward for that data. So if you're gathering data about what I'm seeing and what I'm doing, I might get rewarded for that financially or otherwise through other sorts of services and products. There are a number of people right now, including Tim Berners-Lee, one of the originators of the World Wide Web, or the originator of the World Wide Web, who believes that that's a direction we're going to go, where you build your own sort of personal data store with agents essentially deciding, how do I want to share that data with whom, for what reward, in what circumstance? I think that will be a really interesting shift as we start to see data being treated much more like, as I say, like a currency, like something concrete that we can own, share, decide upon its future. I think that will be a really interesting move. The second one, of course, we have to talk about policy and the government influence around what will happen with some of the big AI providers of technologies. I think it's inevitable we'll see some fairly strict regulations. We might see quite a distinction, though. I think if you've read the work by Dame Wendy Hall and others about the four internets, we no longer have a single internet and a single worldwide web connectivity. We have several. The European view is very different from the US view, is very different from perhaps China and Russian view. And I think that will begin to manifest itself more and more, this sort of breaking apart of the unity of how we see the internet and the regulation around the use of AI and others. You know, in some areas like in Europe, the internet and AI is more of a human right. In places like the US, it's much more commercial. And in places like China and Russia, it's an instrument of the state. That will show itself more and more, I think, in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. And I think before I hand it over to Tony, I'm really struck by your example of the Fitbit as well. And I know I would have worked in health insurance for many years, you know, at some stage during my career. But it intrigues me that the information that you've on that Fitbit, if it's mashed with some of the health insurance information we have, some of it is going back generations. Though it could be grandparents, parents, children now, maybe even grandchildren, that very often it's aware of a history, an element in our history, in our family history that we're not aware, that can be tied to maybe certain vitals on your Fitbit. And I think there is a question about, is that a public good? Should that data be a public good? Is it a company good? Is it owned by the individual? You know, should it be restricted to future generations? You know, if it's a grandparent's data. So I think that's a really fascinating area, and I think there's a lot of value that could be unlocked, but there's a lot of ethical issues as well tied in there. But I love that example. So over to Tony.
Well, look, what can we say, Alan? It's been absolutely fantastic. If you don't follow Alan, you should. You get him on LinkedIn. He's got a newsletter that comes out every Sunday. It's well worth reading. The book is a great read, Alan. So thank you for coming on to share it with us. I also want to thank the Digital Transformation Lab, and I want to thank Cork University Business School for its ongoing support. And I also want to thank our audience because we do it for them. But Alan, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
Alan.
much. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.